No, everything's displaying?
Yeah, that's perfect, Alex.
Awesome. Great. Thanks so much. Good. Okay. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for allowing me to speak today. And thanks to Daryl and Dale and the whole CGLCC crew. I'm really happy to do this. In this webinar, we're going to be exploring some different ways to use this period of social distancing and isolation for ways to develop new and innovative ideas for your business. So obviously, everyone's businesses are going to be changing pretty dramatically coming out of this, and we're hoping that there's a few things that you can do to try and make some of that change for the better. I also do want to acknowledge that there's some companies that are going to be facing some pretty serious things coming out of this too. So I don't want to diminish those folks at all. As Daryl mentioned, if there's questions coming up, I think we'll grab them at the end. I'm not sure if I'm tech savvy enough to be able to answer them throughout this, but we'll give it a go anyway. And I've got some text heavy slides here too, so I'm willing to and happy to share the PDF after this is all said and done for you. So my name is Alex Varricchio, that was already mentioned. So I own a marketing and brand agency, and we work with organizations to position themselves in the market and promote themselves and what they're trying to accomplish. Definitely a marketer by trade, but I can also relate to a lot of the folks on the call that I'm also a business owner. And I think one of the things that we've seen over the last 6 weeks, pretty significant, I guess it's more than 6 weeks now, a couple months that we've seen, is that there's a lot of businesses changing and pivoting in pretty interesting ways. And we've talked about this internally too, just that sort of for better or worse, the period that we're in right now feels sort of like we were back to when we started out. There's not a lot of revenue coming in, not sleeping as much as we'd like to necessarily. We've had to launch things quickly. We're trying things. Some things work, some things don't work. And there's sort of some flexibility in that. Through our work sort of at Uphouse and as a marketer that sort of comes in and helps organizations from the outside, we've worked with lots of different leaders, and this is kind of what we're hoping to talk about a little bit more today. But I think sort of what we do with our work is provide sort of an outside perspective, and it's not necessarily that we have so many more ideas than other folks do. But I think we've sort of realized how valuable outside expertise is and outside thinking is. And we've looked a little bit more around ideas on why it's hard to innovate for your own company and why it's hard to come up with ideas for yourselves. And we are in this unique environment right now where we all have some distance from our own businesses and think that there's some opportunities for folks to really innovate and think differently. So when we talk about this sort of the hangups that come with being involved in your own organization, we call this the proximity paradox. And really that's just the theory that the closer you are to a challenge and the closer you get to your own challenge, the harder it is to see it for what it really is. Now, this sounds like common sense in a lot of ways, but it's pretty difficult. I think as individuals, we're more comfortable managing it, but as businesses, it's a pretty hard challenge for folks to manage. I don't know if you can think of a time when you've had a meeting internally and a team has been sitting together trying to problem solve something for hours on end, and then somebody walks into the room and they point out a blatantly obvious solution that's right in front of you, and you're equally frustrated and equally relieved that you've got it. But just getting that distance sometimes can make a pretty big thing. So our hope in this sort of next little bit here with you is to sort of find those opportunities for your own organization and to sort of see and identify when the proximity paradox might be at play for you, and then we'll look at a few different ways to sort of overcome that. So I don't know if you've ever heard any of these statements made within your own organization. Ask this person who's been here the longest, or we don't have the resources to pull this off right now, or that's a great idea but they never go for it. All of these are instances when the proximity paradox is coming into play. So I think it's doing things that you've done and sticking with them the way that they've always been done, or it's only looking at outside experts for ideas and advice, or it's only taking risks within your industry if somebody else has sort of led the way. So all of those things can kind of get in the way. And the challenge we find with proximity obviously is that most of us don't view it as a hindrance. We celebrate expertise, we celebrate credibility, and we sort of enforce that and teach it as we go on. But ultimately we believe that most of us are too close to our own businesses, and it ends up killing our own ability to create and innovate for our own companies and organizations. So we sort of see overcoming proximity, there's a few different things that we can do. So sort of first, just recognizing that proximity might be at play within your own organization. And I think a big thing with that is sort of letting yourself off the hook a bit. So many people that we'll talk to feel really guilty, or they'll feel like they're idea killers, or they can't develop things for their own company that they want to be able to develop. I think it's a big thing is just recognizing that none of us can do that for our own companies. It's really hard to do. Next is sort of accepting the fact that you may not always be the best person to solve a challenge, and then again, being okay with that. And lastly, what I want to do today is look at some different ways to shake up the way that you traditionally tackle problems, or the way that you might traditionally come up with ideas. I'll try and click here. There we go. So there's sort of three different areas that we look at when we try and shake up sort of our traditional thinking. So I think there's opportunities really to look at the way that you treat your people a little bit differently, the way that you develop your own internal processes differently, and then the way you position yourselves and your business within your industry differently. So we'll go through each of these. I'm going to provide an activity to try for each of these when you're off the call today back with your team. And I think, again, if we can take a look at some of these, it might be helpful. So the first area that we'll look at is how to create distance for your people and how sort of opening that distance up can really help them to create better and bigger ideas. So I'm going to jump into a metaphor here. I hope that's all right with everybody. But one of the times I think the kind of idea of proximity paradox became really clear to me is I was visiting my sister and my then 3-year-old niece, Franca. I got to her house and saw that Franca had pulled out everything out of the bookshelves, off the drawers, out of the closet, all of these things. She had toys, piles, everything in this massive pile in the room. And I talked to her about it and asked her what she was doing. And she said that basically she was going on a trip and she was taking her toys with her. So she explained to me in detail what every single thing was. Some of the toys were toys. Some of the toys were, they all had different reasons, all had different purposes. And it was one of those times when you can really see the imagination of a kid, you know, come to life. So she took her mandatory vacation. She took this trip, had fun with it. And then of course, when it came time to clean it up, my sister ended up doing, you know, most of the heavy lifting. Obviously it's easier for a 3-year-old to pull everything out of the drawers than it is necessarily for them to put it back in. So she did all this. And I think, you know, got me to thinking a little bit about the idea that, you know, as time goes on, you know, the expectation of play will look a little bit different for her. As she gets old enough and learns how to put her things away, she's not necessarily going to make the same size messes that she did before. She'll sort of only start to imagine to the extent that she's, you know, willing to clean up her own mess, and her capacity to create, her capacity to innovate will start to shrink. So of course, I'm not necessarily suggesting we teach kids not to clean up after themselves, but I think there's this, there is an interesting thought in there, and that, you know, if kids or any of us really for that matter, we're not limited necessarily to having to deal with the outcome of what we create. We could create a lot bigger and better ideas. And that's sort of where this model comes into play. So we use this model quite a bit when we're talking about proximity paradox. So it's really kind of that innovation ceiling versus your execution ceiling. So every one of us has this, you know, our innovation ceiling represents the extent to which we can think creatively and think innovatively. It's kind of the highest reaches of our imagination, and it's pretty darn high. And our execution ceiling is, you know, quite a bit lower. So it's that sort of represents the threshold for delivery, you know, our ability to take an idea and deliver it and make it real and tangible. The execution ceiling height's also determined by, you know, our skill set. It's determined by timelines, by budgets, competing responsibilities, you know, physical and emotional energy. We just get tired sometimes. These things get, you know, it becomes hard to come up with new ideas all the time. And as professional adults, the challenge with this is we will only typically innovate essentially to the height of our execution ceiling, which means we lose out on a lot of bigger and better ideas because we feel that we're responsible ultimately to deliver against everything we develop. And the challenge is that over time, that ceiling starts to shrink. So until you can ultimately sort of separate, you know, innovation and execution within yourself, you're only going to innovate to the level at which you can execute your own ideas. And of course, to be effective, we need to create distance between our innovation brain and our execution brain, and we can get a lot more things done. And this is especially true for smaller teams. So the first activity that I will encourage you to try after this is all said and done today is to essentially conduct a disruptor brainstorm. So when we talk about disruptors, you know, you hear more and more about these organizations in the last, you know, several years, but, you know, companies like Skip the Dishes, like Uber, Airbnb, there's sort of 5 characteristics of disruptors that we see. Typically a disruptor comes from outside of the industry. They're often resource scarce. They're bootstrapping a, you know, a product or a project when they come in. They often have a different background or skill set than a CEO may have. And they're usually customer obsessed, and they really want to create that friction-free experience. And oftentimes we'll also see disruptors leveraging tech to remove folks that might be in the middle. So the thing with disruptors also to remember is that they're not necessarily more creative. They just have that distance from your industry, so they can come in without having sort of any of the big thoughts that might get in the way. So when you're conducting this disruptor brainstorm, basically we want you to think like a disruptor. So ignore your execution constraints that you've wrestled with, dial back your industry knowledge, look at your company at a surface level, and think about the game a little bit differently. So to do this, we suggest sort of setting aside a couple of hours and gathering your team together virtually. So you're going to spend some time brainstorming ways to improve your company overall. So we suggest sort of putting together a few different scenarios. I've put some together here. You might, with your company, be able to brainstorm a few more, but, you know, spend 15 minutes blue sky thinking on some of these scenarios. So, you know, the first scenario is not, you know, of course, hoping timelines are a little bit quicker than this, but think about that, context is what if you couldn't serve clients face-to-face for the next year? And then I also like to think about, if you structured your business like a company in a totally different industry, what might that look like? Another one to think about is if you hired independent contractors versus employees, or employees versus independent contractors, or a mix, a little bit of both. Sometimes that can really help you with, unlocking some of the things or getting more things done than you might think possible. And then this is often another one too. I think, think about somebody that that's in a totally different business than you're in. What would they do differently if all of a sudden today they had your role and looked at your company and said, here's all the things I'm going to fix or change. How would that look and how would that go? So once you're done this, compile your ideas, pull some of them together. The goal here is not necessarily to develop concrete, implementable ideas that you're going to do tomorrow, but it just starts getting your mind freed up a little bit so that you can think about some different ideas, some possible solutions to a challenge that you might be having. And the other thing with this is, make sure you can leave your constraints at the door. Try not to say no in this session. It's not about sort of buttoning down. It's about opening things up. And if you're a 1 or 2 person company, I would suggest trying this with, some folks that you may know within a different organization. And another quick thing I think it's worth trying is just in our minds, sometimes I think the more that we can break up innovation versus execution in our day-to-day work really can help us think a little bit differently. So, one of the things I'll say too is like when you're assigning tasks with a team, sort of make sure that it's clearly outlined. This is an innovation task or this is an execution task. If you're setting a meeting agenda, don't sort of mix the two conversations together, separate them into 2 pieces, over the same hour. And then anytime you're having conversations, just ask somebody, is this an innovation conversation or is this an execution conversation? The more and more that we do that, the more we start to free ourselves up. So the next area I'm going to chat about a little bit is creating some distance from your own industry. So, we talk about the idea that your own company can feel like this kind of box of constraints that you have, or, there's always been ways you do things in the past, but an industry is like this as well. And I don't think we give that enough, time or thought that we should. Oftentimes we'll talk to, clients and they'll say they can't be bold with ideas because no one else in their industry is doing it. And they're a little bit nervous to sort of break that mold. And I think ultimately that, every business owner needs a perspective that's totally independent from the industry that they operate in, because there's that kind of code of accepted activities and behaviors that really dictate what is and what's not acceptable as far as what we do in a day. This became really clear to me when I look at the insurance industry. So I think, Geico, that gecko, I think was something that was pretty original, or people view that as pretty original. And I think they view Flow from Progressive as pretty original. But when you actually start to look at it, all of these are US-based insurance companies, and they all have quirky spokespeople that represent them. So it all of a sudden now a quirky spokesperson isn't that bold. It's actually quite a safe idea to do within that space. Again, they're sort of looking at and not going outside of their industry for new ways to inspire themselves. One company that's doing it a little differently is a company called Lemonade. So essentially it's all kind of nuts and bolts insurance. They don't use quirky spokesfolks. And then basically what they do is they donate back any money over and above sort of the profits that they have at the end of the year back to a charity of your choice. Another group too, that when you're looking at your own industry that can get in the way are essentially your own customers, that they understand you and they know you for something. And people may have experienced that too in their own lives when you're trying to, you want to redefine yourself or do something differently. It's often the people that are closest to us that sort of hold us back from being able to do that. So one thing we want to try here is just looking at shaking up your offering and potentially, redeveloping your offering for a new audience. So in this activity, what you're going to do is you're going to challenge yourself to consider some brand new audiences that you may not have thought about before. So we suggest a group of 12 people. Now that might work for large organizations, but if you've got a small company, you can do this over a period of a few days with just a few folks in your company. So what we do with this one is essentially write down a whole bunch of audience groups on a small piece of paper, fold them up and stick them in a hat. So we want to pull as many different audiences that you can think of here. And if you've got other audience ideas, of course, throw those on there as well. But get as many audiences down that you can, because we really are trying to come up with as many ideas as possible. So once you've assembled the groups, sort of break your participants into smaller teams, or again, if you're doing this just with a small team, just do it on your own, and get each group to draw from the audience, pull one of those names out, and then spend 15 minutes brainstorming ways that your current product, or current service that you have might be relevant to that individual. And you want to do this, on a fairly repeat basis. So we suggest doing a few in a row because you just get better and better at them as you go. So some of the questions that you could consider during this is, how could you change your packaging to get a new audience to buy? Or how could you change your delivery method to get a new audience to buy? What could you modify in your offering so that it's relevant and helpful to this audience? Or are there any features that we might be able to tweak or change so that they're more relevant to this group as well? At the end of this, when you're all said and done, get those groups to sort of pitch back the ideas that they had and document all of them. Because again, whether you use them all now or whether you use them down the road, it's going to help to sort of shake up the way that you think about what you're doing. The goal here is to, again, if you can hold 4 rounds of brainstorming, you're going to end up uncovering a lot of new audience groups with this, and you'll likely find some things that'll work pretty well. So when this is all said and done and you've got these ideas set up, we use this is a pretty basic table, but we do find it's helpful. So on the left, existing customer needs, jot down all of those things, that might make sense for your current customers. And then on the far side, think about some of those things that came out from what your future customers might want from you, and just put those on the right. And then anything that you can think of that your future customers may want, but that your current customers may still find valuable, put that in the middle, because that's often your low-hanging fruit and the things that you can make a change with pretty quickly. Awesome. So the last area that I wanted to talk about here is how to innovate by creating distance from process, and that's your internal process in your organization. So if you can think back, if you're a business owner or if you've joined a company recently, think back to when you were sort of first starting your business or when you maybe first joined a business. At that point, there may have been not a lot of process in place. There weren't a lot of systems. The org charts weren't there to sort of bog you down. You really decided what needed to get done, and then you got it done, pretty quickly. And process was not something that would often get in the way. And as time goes on and as responsibilities grow and things change, you're faced with more and more pressure. You've got more of a reputation you need to protect. All of those things then start to get in the way of trying something bold, unique, innovative, or creative. And I often talk about this idea of irresponsible innovation. And really the idea is that innovation often, in most organizations that are established, feels irresponsible. Because usually when you're doing it, it can feel like you're playing or like you're blue sky or you're daydreaming. Oftentimes you'll have these this internal dialogue will start where it feels like, we shouldn't be focusing on this right now. Or, what else could I be doing with my time right now? Or we've got to follow a specific set of protocols, or our reputation's on the line, or this isn't in my job description. All of these things can get in the way of us looking at innovation in a unique way, in a way that sort of is helpful to us. It's really hard to operate in innovation and operate at the same time. And again, you're probably a person that's already stretched thin, and you can always, in theory, be finding something that has more value, but we definitely suggest trying to find some time to innovate and recognizing that it doesn't have to be for a solution tomorrow, but that it's just a good practice to build this thinking and techniques into your organization for the long haul. I think something pretty interesting happened in the last couple of months with COVID, is that we're sort of, and I'm sure folks on the line will have seen it, local businesses that have totally pivoted what they're doing. They've put up delivery options, or they've put up, a new product that they're offering. I know a restaurant here, this weekend was offering Mother's Day flowers through Skip the Dishes, like totally different things than they would normally be doing. And I think what's interesting about the time that we're in right now is that our standard operating processes are way out the window, and expectations of what we were able to accomplish as a business are pretty low. So customers, clients, other folks in the industry are giving us a lot of grace and space right now to explore, to try different things, and support's pretty high. So people are willing to share each other's stories, they're willing to share each other's businesses and promote each other. And there's not a lot of expectations to get things right. So right now we're actually in a pretty unique environment to be able to innovate fairly effectively, because all those standard pressures that we once had on ourselves are kind of out the window. So the last activity I'm going to suggest that you try is launching what I call a fearless initiative. So ultimately, what this is a fearless initiative we talk about is, not expecting big ROI right away on this. We talk about at our company, so we'll fairly frequently try and launch small new products, not because we necessarily think they're going to be, huge money makers for us, but because it's a helpful continuing education project for your team. They learn how to act more nimbly. They learn, decision making, all those types of things happen, and it makes the task a lot easier for when a really good idea comes along that you want to act on. You learn a ton by going through the process, and you want to make sure when you're defining sort of a fearless initiative that it's something that you can bring to market in a matter of weeks, not months. And the biggest thing, and this is really hard to do, is launching it before the product is perfect. So those are some of the things to consider when you're trying to pick an initiative that you think might be worthwhile launching. So to launch a fearless initiative, really what you need to do, and I say all you need to do is, it's still quite a bit of work, but choose a budget, keep a budget, keep it small. And then sort of, again, if you can consider some of that expense in employee development cost or continuing education initiative or investment, that's some ways a helpful way to do it and let yourself go a little further with that budget. And then assemble the team, get really clear on who's owning the project, be sure they're able and have the ownership to be able to pull other folks into it as well. And then try and come up with an idea. And then, again, if it can relate to your industry, perfect. The connection can be loose though the first time you're doing it. This is more about sort of the process of bringing it to life. And ideally, if you've come up with a couple ideas from those previous brainstorms that we talked about, you might be able to use one of those. The next thing to do is, set that deadline, and the sooner you can make and get your product to market, the better. Delays will inevitably kill your enthusiasm and interest in the project. And then the last thing to do is, go through those motions and identify sort of the steps needed to bring your idea to life, make it happen. Like the biggest thing that comes along with this is every step of the way, you're gonna have voices in your head telling you, and they're gonna provide, very real and rational reasons that you should stop working on this. The biggest thing with this is don't give up. Push through to the finish, because quitting is gonna make it that much harder the next time you do it. And if you can push through this, it will start to instill that culture of innovation, start to instill that culture of forward thinking within your team or within your organization. And the last thing is crossing that finish line. So success can look like obviously piles of money if it works out. That's great, but it can also look like development and confidence in the ability to launch a business idea. I had a couple terrible ideas before Uphouse started, launched a couple of them. Didn't necessarily go anywhere, but that confidence in doing it really allowed me to sort of launch a more successful business at the end of it. And I think we find that a lot when you're going through projects or campaigns or whatever that might look like. So yeah, so those are sort of the three activities I wanted to chat on. And I think ultimately, whether innovation is something you're comfortable with, it's something that you do right now in your organization, the practice of innovating, the practice of creating that distance for yourselves, is pretty invaluable. And it's something that if you can do, whether it's on a monthly basis, you set aside a little bit of time to do this. Again, I would encourage you during this period of time that we're in right now. I mean, I'm sure a lot of folks on the line right now are doing some innovations and changing course because they have to, but, pushing through with that, whether or not this particular change you're working right now works well, there's value in what you're doing, and it will sort of help, get you to that next step later on. And I think right now is just embracing that permission we have right now to not get it right. And letting yourself off the hook to sort of launch something that's perfect, that's fully thought through. Companies that are successful will launch sort of iterative ideas as they go, and that really makes a big difference in the long haul. So I'll kind of just go back to that beginning here. What we chatted about a little bit was just sort of when you recognize the distance is, recognize when that distance might be getting in the way for yourself. Accept the fact that you're not always going to be the best person to solve a challenge, and be comfortable with that and be okay with that. And acknowledge, to yourself and to your team that proximity isn't, always a choice, and that we need to bring in other people and collaborate as often as possible. Pull in different brainstorms, try and conduct conversations when you can. If you've got some friends that are in different companies, spend an hour with them talking about what they can be doing differently for their business, and do the same thing, vice versa. Just explore, collaborate as frequently and as often as possible. And calls and forums like this, help us to do that. So yeah, shake up as much kind of traditional thinking as you can. And if you'd like to try these activities, I encourage you to do it. And I'd be happy also to, to chat with anybody on the line too, after this as well, about kind of how you can go about, getting some of these done. But that's, that's what I've got for my sort of formal portion of this. So thanks so much, everybody, for listening into that. I couldn't see everyone's faces, which I wish I could, but that's, thank you very much. And if there's any questions, just let me know and we can go from there.